Hey guys, it's Christian, and welcome to another episode of the Complete Filmography Review, where I pick a filmmaker who's done 10 or so films and go through their filmography and give my thoughts on each of them. And for this video, I decided to do Peter Jackson. He's one of my favorite filmmakers, especially the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which are some of my favorite movies of all time. So I'm actually really excited to go through these films and give my thoughts on them. And for this review, I won't be going through all of Peter Jackson's films. I'll just be specifically going through his Middle-earth saga films. And as I give my thoughts on the film, I won't go through every specific plot beat of the movie, but I'll just give my overall thoughts on the movie and my specific plot points that stick out to me. So without further ado, let's jump in. So first off, we have Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. I think overall, this is probably the best movie of the trilogy, just because in my opinion, it just feels the most like the books. Whereas Two Towers and Return of the King kind of feel more like Peter Jackson's interpretation of the books, but this one specifically feels like Tolkien. So right off the bat, we get the prologue of the creation of the ring, and it gives us all the details about Sauron and the creation of the ring, and the elves and the dwarves and the men, and how they all try to create their own rings of power. And of course, Sauron created the One Ring, which is the one ring to rule them all. So then the elves and the men form the last alliance, and they go against Sauron and his forces. Of course, Isildur cuts off the ring of Sauron's hand and takes the ring, but then instead of destroying it at Mount Doom, he decides to keep the ring for himself, and then the ring eventually betrays him in the end. So then he dies, and the ring eventually comes to creature Gollum, who is actually another one of my favorite characters, and in this movie he kind of gets a brief little cameo, but then he gets expanded more in Two Towers and Return of the King, which we'll get to in a second. So then Gollum has the ring for 4,500 years, and eventually the ring comes to Bilbo, and that's actually set up for the Hobbit movies, but obviously we'll get to those ones in a second. So then Bilbo has the ring, and then he keeps it for 60 years, and then we get to the big preparation for the party, reintroduce the character of Bilbo, and also the character of Gandalf, another one of my favorite characters, who's kind of suspicious about the ring because the whole backstory, which we'll get to more in The Hobbit. Bilbo goes on a quest with a handful of dwarves in order to retake their homeland, and during that journey, that's when he finds the ring. So Gandalf has always been kind of suspicious about the ring, and then when it gets brought up later on, he tells Bilbo, "Are you gonna leave the ring with Frodo?" But obviously Bilbo's really addicted to the ring, and he doesn't really want to. But then eventually Gandalf convinces him to leave the ring behind. So he leaves the ring behind, and then we get introduced to the character of Frodo, who inherits the ring. Then obviously Gandalf tells him that the ring was made by Sauron, and that Sauron is the Dark Lord who disappeared, but now is regaining power. In order to save the Shire, he actually inspires Frodo to take the ring to Rivendell, where he thinks it might be safe. So the first step is to go to the city of Bree, where Gandalf tells Frodo that he's going to meet them there. So he meets up with a couple other hobbits, Samwise Gamgee, probably one of the best characters in the trilogy, Merry and Pippin, who are kind of like these trickster hobbits who are always kind of getting into trouble. So they finally go to Bree, but then they don't see Gandalf there because he was captured by Saruman, who's the white wizard who was corrupted by Sauron. And then another threat that the hobbits are facing is that there's these things called ringwraiths, who are actually the 9 men doomed to die at the beginning of the prologue who were corrupted by the ring. So then they go after the hobbits, but then we get introduced to the character of Aragorn, aka Strider, who's actually a descendant of Isildur, but he wants nothing to do with that lineage because he knows that men failed, so he decides to just be a ranger who helps certain people to get from one place to another. So then Aragorn takes the hobbits to Weathertop. They have the confrontation with the Nazgul. Aragorn defeats him, but then one of the Nazguls stabs Frodo in the shoulder, so then they have to get him to Rivendell for help, and that's when they meet the character of Arwen, who takes them across the ford, and then she uses Elvish to summon the water to turn into these water-like horses and then wash away the Nazgul. So they get to Rivendell. Frodo's finally on the mend. He talks to Sam about, hey, we finally got the ring to Rivendell, but I kind of want to go home now. But then they go to the Council of Elrond, and Elrond is the head elf of Rivendell and the father of Arwen. So they have the Council of Elrond. They come to the decision that the ring needs to be destroyed. And then as all different characters like Boromir of Gondor, Legolas the elf, and Gimli the dwarf are arguing about who should take the ring, Bilbo finally steps up and volunteers to take the ring, and he says, "I will take the ring to Mordor, though I do not know the way." And then that's when the Fellowship forms. We get Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Merry, Pippin, Sam, and of course Boromir. And they finally set up together to Mordor, and we have that epic shot of them walking up the mountain, and then we get the dun 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 Fellowship of the Ring theme, which is awesome. So their original plan is to go to the Gap of Rohan, but then Saruman's forced their spying on them, so then they decide to go to the Path of Caradhras, which is like this snowy mountain. But then Saruman uses his spells to create an avalanche on the mountain, so then the Fellowship have no choice but to go through the Mines of Moria, which Gimli recommends. So they go through Moria, they encounter the Watcher in the Water, which brings down the gate, so they have no choice but to go through the mountain. They encounter goblins, they encounter the Balrog, and they go across the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, but then the Balrog is pursuing them, so then Gandalf sacrifices himself, then has that epic line of, "You shall not pass!" Puts his staff down, the bridge breaks, Balrog falls down, and then he whips his fire whip around Gandalf's ankle. Gandalf falls off the side, holds onto the cliff, and says, "Fly, you fools, go!" And then falls off the side. So then all the characters are losing hope. They exit the mountain. They decide to go to Lothlorien to kind of regroup and figure out what they need to do next. Frodo's obviously feeling very doubtful about himself. He looks into the mirror of a character named Galadriel, who's the head elf of Lothlorien, sees that if the ring isn't destroyed, the Shire will be destroyed. So then that remotivates Frodo to continue his quest. So then the Fellowship leaves. They get gifts from the Lothlorien elves. They sail down the river. And then in the meanwhile, Saruman's growing an army of Uruk-hai, which are kind of like orc-goblin hybrids, to go after the Fellowship. So everything kind of comes to a climax in Amon Hen. There's a character named Lurtz who's the head of the Uruk-hai. He kills Boromir, he takes the hobbits, because Saruman told him that one of the halflings had the ring, so they take Merry and Pippin. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli decide to go after them, and then Frodo and Sam are left to go on a journey alone to Mordor, and then that leads us right into the Two Towers. Frodo and Sam meet up with the character of Gollum, who I talked about earlier, and then after a confrontation they convince Gollum to take them to Mordor, because secretly Gollum has a plan to take them to the character named Shelob, who's this giant spider. Then she'd kill them, and then he would take the ring for himself, so they go off on their journey, and then meanwhile we have Merry and Pippin, who are being taken by the Uruk-hai, with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli hot on their trail. Then we also get introduced to the world of Rohan. There's a character named King Theoden, who's the head of Rohan, but he's under a spell by Saruman, so then the kingdom of Rohan's kind of in ruin. Then we have his niece named Eowyn, who's trying to do everything she can to fight for the kingdom. Then we have the character of Eomer, who's Theoden's nephew, who gets banished by Theoden under a character named Grima Wormtongue's influence, who's kind of like the advisor of the king, but he's also been corrupted by Saruman. So meanwhile, we cut back to the outside of Fangorn Forest. Merry and Pippin are able to escape because Eomer and his forces wipe out those orcs. They escape into Fangorn Forest and meet up with the character of Treebeard, who's this giant walking, talking tree. And then we cut to Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go into Fangorn Forest, and they meet up with Gandalf, who's been resurrected after his fight with the Balrog, so now he's Gandalf the White. Then he tells them about the war that's about to be happening, with Saruman creating more Uruk-hai to go after all the people of Rohan and wipe them out. So then they go to Rohan, they free Theoden from his spell, they banish Wormtongue, and they convince the king to leave the city of Edoras and go to a stronghold called Helm's Deep. So they finally start their journey to Helm's Deep. They get attacked by wargs sent by Saruman. Aragorn goes off the cliff, and he's presumed dead, but he's actually alive and gets saved by his horse named Brago, who was given to him by Eomer early on. He sees the army, goes to Helm's Deep, warns Theoden, and then they get ready for war. And then finally we get the huge battle of Helm's Deep, which is epic and amazing. That's another thing about the Two Towers. I think it's probably my favorite out of the trilogy. And I know it's probably not the most accurate to the book, but I think just because it just has so many action moments, Battle of Helm's Deep alone is definitely one of the highlights. And then as the battle goes on, the Uruk-hai get the upper hand, and then all hope seems lost, and our heroes have to retreat into the upper part of the fortress. And then meanwhile, we cut to Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, who are making their way to Mordor. And then as this story goes on, Frodo is also slowly but surely getting corrupted by the ring. But then halfway through, they get captured by the character of Faramir, who's actually the brother of Boromir. And Faramir is also kind of getting corrupted by the ring as well, so he decides to take him to the city of Osgiliath so he can prove himself to his father Denethor, who we'll get to in Return of the King. That's kind of one of the scenes I missed from the extended version that's not in theatrical, is this whole flashback scene of the relationship between Boromir, Faramir, and Denethor. How Denethor favors Boromir because he's the firstborn, and then Faramir is kind of like a failure in his eyes. But we'll get to more of the relationship in Return of the King. They go to Osgiliath, then all hope seems lost. It's kind of like this war-torn area that's outside of Minas Tirith, which will get expanded to more in Return of the King. And it's actually being attacked by Sauron's forces. And then when all hope seems lost, a Nazgul actually swoops in and goes after Frodo. He goes up to one of the high points of Osgiliath and actually offers the ring to the Nazgul. But then Sam, being the hero that he is, charges up the stairs, grabs Frodo and pulls him off the side, and they roll down the stairs. And then Frodo nearly kills Sam, but then Sam's like, "But you're Sam. Don't you know you're Sam?" And then Frodo kind of comes back to normal, and then feels all hopeless, and then Sam gives that awesome speech at the end. And then we kind of cut to these other different moments in the storylines of Aragorn seeing the light inside Helm's Deep, and then knowing that Gandalf will return, because earlier he went off to go find Eomer and his forces in order to be reinforcements for Rohan. So they charge out of Helm's Deep. We have that epic moment of "For Thelingas!" from Theoden. We have the epic music of them going down the causeway, and we get the music, which is epic. And they look up the hill, they see the light, they see Gandalf and Eomer and his forces charging down the hill, taking on the Uruk-hai, and then all the Uruk-hai retreat. And we cut to Merry and Pippin convincing Treebeard and the Ents to fight Saruman and his forces. They go to Isengard, see that everything's been destroyed. Obviously, Treebeard's upset. He gets all the other Ents, and they have their last march of the Ents on Isengard. They break the dam, the water comes in and floods Isengard, so all of this industry that Saruman has is destroyed. Another theme that Tolkien brought in his books is how all this nature is being destroyed by industry, so I'm glad that Peter Jackson kept that in the movies. Then we cut back to Osgiliath. Faramir sees just how corrupt this ring can be and how dangerous it can be, so he decides to let the hobbits go, and they're free to go off to continue their journey to Mordor. But in the meantime, Gollum is still scheming to take the hobbits to her to kill him off and then take the ring for himself. Then we have that awesome pan-up shot from the forest of Ithilien all the way up the stairs of Cirith Ungol, all the way up to the peak of Mordor, and we see Mount Doom and Sauron in the background. And we know that they're getting closer and closer to achieving their goal. And that leads us right into Return of the King. I think overall this is probably the most satisfying of the trilogy, for obvious reasons. This is the great ending that we're trying to lead up to. So we pick up where we left off. Part of the Fellowship's reunited. Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, and Gandalf meet up with Merry and Pippin, who are in Isengard. And that's another thing that we kind of missed from the theatrical version, is kind of like the closure from the whole Isengard flooding sequence, where in the extended version, we see the deaths of Saruman and Wormtongue. And that's actually a callback to the end of the book, The Scouring the Shire, where Saruman actually dies there. But in the movie, they put it up to the front just to give a resolution to that whole storyline with Saruman. But in that scene, Pippin finds a Palantir, and the Palantir is a seeing stone, which is a way that Saruman is able to communicate with Sauron and can kind of see different places within Middle-earth with this device. So then Pippin takes it, but then obviously Gandalf says, "Fool of a took," and takes it from him. They go back to Edoras, and they kind of like unwind and celebrate the victory of Helm's Deep. And then later that night, Pippin actually steals a Palantir from Gandalf and looks into it and then sees Sauron's eye and then sees his plan. Gandalf's like, "What's going on?" And then Pippin says that he saw a white tree, and then Gandalf deduces that that was actually from Minas Tirith and that Sauron actually plans to strike the city of Minas Tirith. So then Gandalf and Pippin go to Minas Tirith. They meet up with Denethor. They try to warn him about this oncoming threat that Sauron has with his army. But then Denethor, being Denethor, he's super depressed of the fact that Boromir was slain down, who was his favorite son, who I was talking about earlier. So he's obviously kind of useless. So Gandalf and Pippin have to try to find a way to convince Theoden's army to come for reinforcements in order to help in this grand battle. So then Pippin lights the beacons. It gets a signal to Rohan, and then Aragorn sees it. He bursts into the doors of Theoden's palace and then says, "The beacons of Minas Tirith! Beacons are lit! Gandalf calls for aid." And we get that epic shot of Theoden kind of contemplating and saying, "And Rohan will answer. Muster the Rohirrim." So then the Rohirrim are on their way to Minas Tirith for the reinforcements. But as they're kind of in their camp, they realize that they're probably not going to be enough to destroy Sauron's army. So then Elrond actually goes into the camp and meets up with Aragorn and tells him that he has to go to the Pass of the Dead in order to meet with the King of the Dead and convince him to join in the battle against Sauron's forces. So then he presents him with the Sword of Anduil, which is actually the sword that Isildur used to cut the ring from Sauron's hand. So now it's been finally reforged, and then Aragorn can use it in order to convince the King of the Dead to join their army. So then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go to the Paths of the Dead. They meet with King of the Dead, and then the theatrical kind of cuts there because you don't get the answer, which is fine. It kind of gives more suspense of like, are the heroes going to be able to convince the King of the Dead to fight in this army or not? I don't know. We'll have to find out. But then in the extended version, after the whole earthquake scene and then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli escape, they see the Corsair ships, which are like kind of like these pirate ships that were recruited by Sauron in the distance, seeing them on their way to Minas Tirith, and then the King of the Dead says, "We fight." So we finally cut to Minas Tirith. We get the whole battle, the Siege of Gondor. All hope seems lost. Gandalf and Pippin have their backs to the wall, like, "Oh no, what are we gonna do?" And then finally we get the we see in the distance Theoden, and we also have Merry and Eowyn join the battle, in disguise, and the Riders of Rohan charging up the brow. And we have this whole epic battle of Pelennor Field, which is amazing, and then when you think that the heroes have it all together, we finally get the Mumakil, which are these giant elephant things stomping on all the horses and, swinging their tusks with spikes on them to kill them all. So we get those epic shots, and then it's just like, oh no, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And then finally we get the Corsair ships. You think like, oh no, Sauron's forces are mustering. All hope is lost for the heroes. But then we get Aragorn jumping off the side along with Legolas and Gimli, and then the orcs are kind of looking at him like, yeah, okay, we can take them. And then Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli charge. They get the army of the dead behind them. They charge into Pelennor Fields. More epicness. Legolas has his epic moment with the Mumakil, slaying him down. They have their counting of how many orcs that they kill down. Finally, the battle is won. Everything's all good. And meanwhile, we cut to Frodo, Sam, and Gollum going up the stairs of Curathungel. Then Gollum has his plan to get rid of Sam by making Frodo think that Sam's been stealing all the food. So then Frodo sends Sam home. They continue to go to Shelob's lair. Frodo's by himself, where actually in the book it was Frodo and Sam who go together, but Peter wanted to have more suspense with that, so he decided to have Frodo go alone. Frodo goes in, has a confrontation with Shelob, gets away, but then Shelob stabs him. He's stunned, gets wrapped up in the spiderweb, and then Sam comes in with Sting that Frodo lost earlier in the cave, and then he has this like, "Let him go, you filth! Let him go! You will not touch him again. Come on and finish it." And has this fight with Shelob, defeats Shelob, is about to save Frodo, but then orcs come in, take Frodo away. Sam goes after them, has more epic moments of like, "That's for Frodo! That's for the Shire! That's for my old gaffer!" Meets up with Frodo. Frodo realizes, oh no, they took the ring. But then Sam has the ring, gives it back to Frodo. They continue on to Mordor in disguise. And then again, in the extended version, they have a whole confrontation with the orcs as they're actually going towards the Black Gates, because Aragorn has this whole plan, which is also in the extended version, but not in the theatrical version, where he tries to distract Sauron. And so that Sauron strikes too soon, goes to the Black Gates, and has this whole battle outside there, so that Sam and Frodo are able to go to Mordor. So then they continue to go to Mordor. They finally get to Mount Doom. They go inside, and then meanwhile we have the whole battle outside the Black Gates. So we kind of have these two storylines going on. Frodo's about to destroy the ring, but then he gets corrupted by it, and then puts on the ring, turns invisible. Sam's all like, no! no! And then Gollum, who's been following him the whole time, pounces on top of Frodo, bites his finger off, takes the ring, holds it up, and he's like, precious, precious. And then in the book, he actually just, falls off the side and dies. But then Peter wanted to have more tension with that scene, so he decides to have Frodo have a fight with Gollum. So they're arguing with the ring, they're pulling it left and right, which is actually a callback to the opening of the film where Smeagol and Deagle, Smeagol's cousin, are fighting over the ring, and then Smeagol actually kills Deagle. But in this one, they both fall off the side. Gollum falls off the side, goes into the lava, he disappears, and the ring's just sitting there. Frodo's on the side of the cliff, he's about to kill himself because he just wants to end it all, but then we have that epic line from Sam, like, don't you let go of reach! Frodo puts out his hand, Sam takes it, he pulls him up, the ring gets destroyed, Sauron's like, ah! He's a giant flaming eyeball, he's screaming, Barad-dûr gets destroyed, the Black Gates of Mordor gets destroyed, Mount Doom blows up in an epic explosion, and then the heroes are kind of looking at it the whole time. They're happy that the ring's destroyed, but then they realize, oh wait, Frodo was still in there, he's probably dead. And then Frodo and Sam run out just in time, they jump off into like a little cliffside surrounded by lava. All hope seems lost, the movie could end there. Frodo talks about how he can see the Shire again, and then Sam talks about how he wants to see Rosie Cotton again. Frodo puts his arm around him, he's like, I'm glad to be with you, Sam, here at the end of all things. Fades to black, you think the movie's gonna end there, but then we get all of our endings, and I know a lot of people hate all the different multiple endings and everything like that, but I mean, I don't mind them. I think if you watch the trilogy in one run, it really just seems like it's just wrapping up all these different storylines. So then you have the Eagles coming in, saving Frodo and Sam, them waking up in Minas Tirith, reuniting with the other members of the Fellowship. You get the whole coronation scene of Aragorn finally becoming king. He meets with Arwen, his long lost love, and then we get the whole emotional scene of Aragorn saying, you bow to no man, and all the characters bowing down to the hobbits, and then we cut to the hobbits returning to the Shire, and then life has just gone on without them. Everyone's kind of looking at them like, oh, who are those little weird guys over there? But then obviously that was Tolkien's way of showing that innocent soldiers going off to war and then coming back and not being the same. And then Sam looks and sees Rosie Cotton, gets married, and then Frodo's like writing his book, a continuation from There and Back Again, and then The Lord of the Rings by Frodo Baggins, little meta reference right there. But then obviously Frodo's still being affected by the ring. He doesn't feel like he can go on living. So then him, Bilbo, Gandalf, and the elves go to the Grey Havens, which is like the Undying Lands, kind of like away from Middle Earth in order to live peacefully. And they sail off, and they get another emotional scene of Frodo saying goodbye to all the other hobbits, and then Frodo giving the book to Sam to say that his story will go on. Cut to the very end, Sam returning home with Rosie Cotton, and then seeing his two little kids, and then we get the last line that was actually in the book of Sam going like, well, I'm back. Them going inside their hobbit hole, closing the door, and then that's the end of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I'm not crying. You're crying. So obviously you can see that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is definitely one of my favorite trilogies of all time. They're pretty much like three perfect movies in my opinion, no matter what people say, like, oh, it's just people walking. It's like, no, it's actually more than that. It's actually an emotional story about good versus evil and how evil can corrupt good people, and that how good people can overcome this evil by working together in a fellowship, and good ultimately always wins. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. But then we get into the Hobbit trilogy, which, kind of had a lot of ups and downs in its development. Peter Jackson was wanting to adapt The Hobbit way earlier on, but he didn't have the rights to it, so he decided to just do the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then, as the popularity of the Lord of the Rings movies came about, the idea of a Hobbit movie became more and more solidified. So then, after all these different rights battles and all these little different legal issues, New Line finally gave the go-ahead to Peter Jackson to make the Hobbit movies. And then, of course, Peter Jackson already directed an epic fantasy trilogy, so he didn't really want to do it again. So he actually had Guillermo del Toro do it. But then just with all the production delays and all the legal battles and just all this up and down production with union disputes and everything, and all these different studio changes of bankruptcy and like rebuying different companies and all this stuff, the project kept getting delayed. And then obviously Guillermo del Toro was like a very creative guy, so he didn't want to stay on there forever, so he decided to depart, and that kind of left Peter, Fran Walsh, and Philip Boyens in a bit of a bind. Whereas Guillermo del Toro had years and years and years to develop his version of the Hobbit movies before going into production. They didn't decide to give Peter Jackson another year and a half to redevelop the story in his way. They kind of just gave him 5 months before going to production. So I guess that's why I give the Hobbit movies a little bit of grace. Obviously they're not my favorite movies of all time, but actually going into behind the scenes and seeing all the ups and downs with production, and then not only that, but Peter Jackson didn't have time to redevelop this whole series in his vision. Obviously he wanted Guillermo del Toro to take it on. So anyway, he got the green light and finally made the movies, even though he knew that he was winging it and kind of making up as he went along. But anyway, here are my thoughts on The Hobbit. So let me start off with The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, and overall I think this one's a pretty good movie. It definitely stays true to the book for sure. I think this is probably the one that probably stays most true to the book. I think the only thing that they add added, obviously, were the whole subplot with Gandalf, which they took different moments from the appendices at the end of the Return of the King book and then sprinkled it through the movie. The whole subplot of Gandalf meeting with the White Council and talking about the Morgul Blade and how it could be Sauron regaining power again, and the whole investigation at Dol Guldur, and the whole necromancer and all that storyline. So I appreciate that they were trying to expand the movies a little bit more and not just be like a self-contained adventure story. I know originally they were trying to do 2 films. It was going to be The Hobbit, and then The Hobbit Part 2 was going to kind of be a bridge film between the Hobbit movie and then Lord of the Rings trilogy, which I thought would have been interesting. But then as they were developing, they realized that the Hobbit movie is actually a lot more complicated than they thought. So they decided to get rid of the bridge film idea and then just expand the Hobbit movie into 2 parts. So I think that would have been really cool. I don't know, originally it's going to be The Hobbit Unexpected Journey and then The Hobbit There and Back Again, which actually would have been great. But then as time went on, Peter said there was just like a lot more story to tell, so we decided to go from 2 movies to 3 movies. But we'll get to that in a second. Back to Unexpected Journey. So then we also start off with a prologue. It's kind of like an in medias res kind of storyline with Bilbo Baggins writing his book. This takes place directly before the events of Fellowship of the Ring. He flashes back to his adventures 60 years earlier and explains this whole backstory about the city of Dale, which is this city that is inhabited by dwarves and men. And then we have the lonely mountain called Erebor, which is the dwarf stronghold, where the characters of Thorin and his father Thrain and his grandfather Thor are kind of like the rulers of this lonely mountain, and they have all this treasure, and they have this gem called the Arkenstone, which is this very valuable stone that everyone's kind of after as we get more and more into the story. And then when everything's all good and everything's thriving, we get the character of Smaug, who's this giant dragon who invades the town of Dale, destroys everything, invades the mountain of Erebor, wipes out nearly all the dwarves, and then takes over all the treasure. So then Thorin and a handful of dwarves escape from Erebor and are kind of like in the wastelands of Middle-earth, and they're trying to regain their homeland. Then we have the character of Thranduil, who's kind of like the king of the Wood Elves, who is in alliance with the dwarves, but then as he sees the dwarves in peril, he decides to turn their back on them and then go away. And then in the extended version, the reason why is because the dwarves actually have these valuable gems that they kind of hid away from the elves, so that kind of causes the divide between them. So we cut to present day, we get introduced to the character of Bilbo, and we get the younger version of Bilbo, played by Martin Freeman, who actually, probably out of all the characters, he's definitely one of my favorite actors from the cast. Just the way he played Bilbo, it's not quite how he is in the book, but I like how he kind of has the spirit of Bilbo and kind of makes it his own. So then Bilbo meets with Gandalf the Grey this time, who tells him about this whole mission to go to Erebor and reclaim it and defeat Smaug the dragon. But obviously they need a burglar to get in, someone who's small and can kind of evade Smaug, try to find his weak spot, and then give a chance for the dwarves to defeat him and then reclaim their mountain. So then Bilbo gets introduced to all 13 dwarves, who I won't name because there's just too many, and they try to convince him to join this mission, but Bilbo just wants to stay home. He loves his books, he loves his armchair, he loves his good food, but then he has that spirit of adventure because he's part Took, and the Took hobbits are these mischievous hobbits who are like always into adventure. So then, at the last minute, Bilbo decides to go with the dwarves and join the adventure, and then as the story goes on, they run into a bunch of different obstacles. They have encounter with 3 huge trolls, they get attacked by wargs, or these kind of like giant wolf things. They meet up with Elrond and the other elves. They encounter these giant rock creature things, which actually are not quite in the book. They're kind of more described as cave trolls, and they kind of produce like the sound of thunder because of their whole battle and everything. It's just like this small paragraph in the book, but then Peter Jackson expands it into this giant action sequence. So they go into the Misty Mountain for coverage. They get separated. The dwarves have an encounter with the goblins and Goblin King in Goblin Town, and then they encounter this giant fat goblin king with this giant gorder, and yeah, I won't really talk about that. But then on the flip side, Bilbo finally has his encounter with Gollum, which is probably one of the most accurate scenes in the movie. Bilbo actually finds the ring. They have their whole riddles in the dark scene, and then eventually Gollum finds out that he took the ring, goes after him, but then Bilbo puts the ring on, turns invisible, and gets away. The characters reunite with Gandalf's help. They're chased away by the wargs, and they're actually pursued by another character named Azog, who's this giant white orc who actually killed Thorin's grandfather in the whole battle outside Moria, and Thorin actually cut off Azog's hand, so now they're kind of wanting revenge on each other. So then they have their whole confrontation, but then Gandalf summons the eagles and saves all the characters, which, yeah, let's just talk about the eagles. I know in the book they come and save them, but then as time went on, Tolkien wanted the eagles to not come when it was like super convenient for the characters. They wanted to come when Middle-earth was kind of mostly imbalanced. So it's a little bit of a contradiction after watching Lord of the Rings and then watching the Hobbit movies, where it's like, oh, you could have just taken the eagles all the way to Mordor and like destroyed the ring, but then Peter Jackson's interpretation, the Nazgul would have taken them out. They're not Middle-earth taxis, but then here they kind of are Middle-earth taxis because it's kind of a contradiction, but it's also true of the book. So anyway, they get saved. Instead of the Eagles taking them all the way to Erebor, they kind of take them to this little mountain peak where Erebor is like way off in the distance. And then, Bilbo has this whole line of like, I do think the voice is behind us. But then we cut to Erebor, cut to the treasure room. The treasure slides off of Smaug's eye, and then he opens it up, and then we cut to black, and we realize like, oh shoot, the ring's not over yet. We still have this whole big dragon we have to confront. And that leads us right into Desolation of Smaug. And this is probably my favorite of the 3 movies. I mean, it's not saying a lot. It's probably the most rewatchable out of the 3 movies. But anyway, so we pick up where we left off. The characters are trying to run away from Azog and his forces. They get saved by the character of Beorn, who's this kind of like an animagus from Harry Potter. In his human form, he's this very tall man, but in his animal form, he's this black bear. So then he saves them, and they go to the forest of Mirkwood, which is kind of like this dark forest that's been corrupted by Sauron's forces, and there's these giant spiders in there who are trying to kill the characters. But then they end up getting saved by Legolas, Tauriel, and a couple of the Wood Elves. And obviously, these characters were not in the book, but Peter Jackson wanted to put them in the movie in order to have that bridge from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings. And I guess we'll just get into Legolas and Tauriel. I don't mind the fact that Legolas is in this movie. I think it's really cool to have that bridge because he's one of my favorite characters from the original trilogy, so it's cool seeing him here. Then the character of Tauriel, she could have been this really awesome character. Then one of the downsides is that they give her a love triangle between her, Legolas, and then one of the dwarves named Keely, who's like the hot dwarf, the beardless dwarf who looks like a mini version of Aragorn or something. So she kind of goes from like this being this really strong character, this being this really kind of like vulnerable character and everything. I know they're trying to add more female characters into The Hobbit because there's no mention of female characters in the book, except for like a brief mention of Galadriel. But yeah, I think they could have just gotten rid of the whole love triangle dynamic. It's kind of like a little meta reference to the fact that Evangeline Lilly was in a love triangle situation in the Lost series between her, Jack, and Sawyer. But anyway, so they get rescued, taken to Thranduil. Thorin has a whole confrontation with him. They get sent to prison, and then Bilbo, who actually got separated from the characters, comes in and then rescues him from the prison, puts him in the barrels, and we get the whole epic barrel chase sequence, which, obviously goes over the top and is very cartoony. But anyway, we won't dwell on that. So they get away. They made up with the character of Bard the Bowman, who's actually another really cool character, very Aragorn-esque. The fact that his father was the one who used a device called the Black Arrow to try to destroy the dragon Smaug, but it actually just bounced off his chest, and one of the scales fell off, creating this vulnerable spot in Smaug. So then the dwarves try to take this information and use it to slay Smaug in order to reclaim Erebor. So then we get introduced to the leader of Lake Town, and there's assistant Alfred, who are briefly mentioned in the book, but they're not really big characters. But the only reason why I kind of accept their inclusion in the movie is just to play on the theme of greed, with the fact that the master of Lake Town is really just all about the gold. He doesn't really care about the people. They're kind of in this kind of desolate town, and then that kind of mirrors where Thorin will end up once he actually reclaims Erebor and kind of gives into the dragon sickness and has this greed about all this treasure and everything, but we'll get to that in a second. So then the dwarves get away from Lake Town. We kind of have 3 different storylines going on, because during the whole barrel scene, Keely gets shot by a poison arrow from one of the orcs, and then is taken to Lake Town and kind of on the mend with a couple of the characters there. Azog's forces attack Lake Town, and Legolas and Tauriel come in to try to defend them, and Ariel has a kind of like awkward scene of her trying to heal Keely, and then the lights glowing behind her. I know it's a callback to where Frodo got stabbed on Weathertop and like looks and sees Arwen walking up to him kind of glowing, but still kind of awkward here. So they have their storyline, and then we cut to the dwarves and Bilbo going into Erebor, trying to confront Smaug. Bilbo, in the book, he puts on the ring and then goes into the treasure room and has this whole confrontation with Smaug. But in this one, he doesn't have the rings, and they have their whole confrontation. Another meta reference, because Smaug is played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who played Sherlock in Sherlock, and then Martin Freeman plays Bilbo, who also played Watson in Sherlock. So it's kind of like them having another conversation again with each other. So then, as they're having a conversation, Smaug's trying to figure out like who Bilbo is and everything, like where did he come from, and then Bilbo actually lets it slip that he's called Barrel Rider, and that's kind of like a little hint to Lake Town. And then Smaug remembers that the people of Lake Town try to kill him earlier with the whole Black Arrow, and then he kind of gets suspicious, like, are they trying to come in to steal my treasure and all this stuff? So then Smaug hints that he's going to destroy Lake Town. He breaks out of the treasure room. The dwarves have their whole fight with him, which, obviously wasn't in the book at all, but since the fact that this movie was going to be 2 films and they split into 3, they had to have a whole epic climax, and they have this whole improbable ending of the dwarves restarting the forge and then creating this giant gold statue of a dwarf that's not quite fully finished. So then it melts and then covers Smaug in all this gold, so they think he's dead, but then Smaug gets upset, bursts out of the gold, bursts out of Erebor, goes to Lake Town, and then is about to destroy it. And then Bilbo and the dwarves are kind of like left like, what have we done? And then we kind of cuts to black, and then that leads us right into Battle of Five Armies. And then we have the whole epic opening scene of Smaug destroying Lake Town. Bard tries to fulfill his destiny, tries to shoot the black arrow at Smaug in his kind of weak spot, but the bow gets destroyed. So then he actually has to put the bow on his son to aim it. Fires the arrow, hits Smaug in his weak point. Smaug dies, falls on top of the master, kills him. Then their town is left all destitute, so they're wondering like, what are we gonna do? So then the only choice is to go to the city of Dane, which is outside of Erebor, which has now been taken over by Thorin and the dwarves. And Thorin has his crown on. As I said earlier, he's giving in to the dragon sickness. He wants nothing to do with helping people. So then the men are left saying like, what do we do? And then Thranduil and then the rest of the elves make an alliance with Bard the Bowman in order to fight Thorin, in order to reclaim the mountain and have a home for the people of Lake Town. So they're in alliance. They try to reason with Thorin, but Thorin's having none of it. And then Bilbo, seeing this conflict that's about to come to light, and then also in the background, Azog and his forces actually coming to take over the mountain as well. He decides to take the Arkenstone and then take it to Bard and Thranduil in order to make peace with them so that there's no battle. Then Thorin obviously finds out about this. He gets upset with Bilbo, vanishes from the mountain, and then kind of slowly but surely kind of descends into his dragon sickness, kind of becomes like a shut-in within Erebor. And then the tension kind of grows and grows and grows. And then meanwhile, we cut to the character of Dane, this kind of Scottish dwarf thing with this kind of red hair mohawk and kilt and this giant hog thing that he rides, which is played by Billy Connolly, who was actually originally considered for the character of Gimli, but then he dropped out due to scheduling conflicts. So it's kind of cool seeing him here, but then he's digital. So I call him Digi-Dane because when Billy Connolly actually had the prosthetic on, Billy Connolly didn't come through, so they decided to have a digital version of him instead. So he's a Digi-Dane going against the elves and men to retake the Arkenstone and get rid of the elves because of their conflict they had. And then suddenly, when tensions are rising with that, more armies come in. You have Azog with his army, and then Bolg, his son, with his army. So now you finally have the Battle of Five Armies and everything that we've finally been leading up to, which is actually just a couple pages in the book, but obviously here is expanded to be the whole movie, which, because why not? Gotta make that money. So then we have the whole battle, which is pretty epic, but I guess the stakes aren't as dire because it's just a battle for treasure and not necessarily a battle for the fate of Middle-earth. So obviously the stakes are gonna be a little bit lower, but I mean, it's still, pretty fun battle, I suppose. So then all the armies are clashing. Bilbo and the characters in the middle of it. Bilbo's trying to convince Thorin to end all this conflict. And then Thorin finally makes that decision to actually help. And I actually think this is like a really cool scene in the movie. He decides to charge out of Erebor with the other 12 dwarves and fight Azog and his forces. Then we get the whole rematch between Azog and Thorin. Thorin gets the upper hand on Azog, and he kind of goes into the water, and you think he's dead, but then he stabs Thorin's foot. He falls to the ground. Azog's about to stab Thorin, but then Thorin puts up his sword, but then he realizes that the only way out is to sacrifice himself, so he moves his sword out of the way. Azog stabs him, but then Thorin stabs Azog, so then Azog finally dies, and then Thorin's left dying. And then cut to Fili and Kili, who are killed by Bolg, but then Legolas and Tauriel come in this kind of impossible boss battle because Legolas and Bolg at their battle in Desolation of Smaug, so this is like a rematch. And then we get the whole kind of like video game-esque sequence of them on the bridge. Bolg tries to destroy the bridge, and then Legolas is kind of going up the falling debris, kills Bolg and everything, which is obviously very ridiculous, but whatever. It's the last movie. Why not have some kind of ridiculous moment with Legolas? So then Tauriel and Kili have their final moment together, and then finally the battle is all won. They have their victory. Bilbo, who was knocked out at the beginning of the battle, wakes up, sees that Thorin is dying. They have their last moment together of redemption. Thorin thanks Bilbo for redeeming him in the end, kind of like a little callback to Boromir sacrificing himself and then being redeemed in the end. Gandalf comes beside him. They sit down. They have their quiet moment. This is probably my favorite moment in the whole movie, where it's just quiet and the characters are kind of reflecting on their moments. And then we have their whole resolution. The dwarves stay in Erebor, having reclaimed their land. They open up Dane to the people of Lake Town. Bard becomes a new leader, and then Thranduil tells Legolas to go find a character named Strider, who obviously is a setup for the character of Aragorn, so that ties The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings. And then we finally get Bilbo returning to the Shire, seeing that all this stuff's being auctioned off, and then he realizes like, no, I'm not dead, I'm here, stop auctioning my stuff. So then he gets all of his stuff back, and then we have him, writing stuff down in his book. Then we fast forward to present day, where Bilbo's finishing up his book, The Hobbit. Again, a little meta reference to the book. And then we hear the knock on the door, and then we get the lines from Fellowship of the Ring. No, thank you. We don't want any visitors, well wishes, or distant relations. And then Gandalf says, and what about very old friends? And then obviously that's a spark that gets Bilbo to the door, and then then it kind of leads us right back into Fellowship of the Ring. So everything's all full circle, reunited. Cut to credits, we get the amazing song from Billy Boyd, and then that's the end of the Hobbit trilogy. So obviously not as good as Lord of the Rings for multiple reasons, I said earlier, but I think overall it's fine. It's definitely not something that I rewatch all the time. I don't have it on DVD and Blu-ray and everything. I just stream it on HBO Max or something. But yeah, it's not really my thing. But it was fun watching it at the time. I was in college when I watched the movies, and I watched each movie in theaters, so it was kind of cool seeing, because I hadn't watched Lord of the Rings in theaters because I was a little too young. But watching the Hobbit movies is like a tradition for like me and my roommates. We would go and have fun. It was cool being back in Middle Earth. But yeah, I'm glad that it's finally over. We kind of get all the answers that we needed that was set up in Lord of the Rings. All the questions that we were wanting, like what happened in the Hobbit, what did it look like, and all this stuff. We got the Rings of Power show, which is pretty good, not as good as Lord of the Rings, but I think a little bit better than the Hobbit. I know it got mixed reviews here and there, but overall I think it was pretty cool. So we'll see what happens if it gets a second season or not. And then I think there's like rumors that there'll be more Middle Earth stuff, just because there's just so much to tell with these books and everything. So yeah, I'm excited to see more. But yeah, overall those are my thoughts on the Middle Earth saga and my thoughts on Peter Jackson himself. I still think he's an amazing filmmaker. I love a lot of his movies, and yeah, I can't wait to see what he does more in the future. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. What's your favorite Middle Earth movie? Do you prefer Lord of the Rings? Do you prefer The Hobbit? Do you like the books better than the movies, or vice versa? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time. My precious.